Hello everyone. I'm Nemo. I do tech security and open source things at Razorpay. Uh, I'm here to talk about building a roadmap for a FOSS UPI application. This is a project dear to my heart. I want to be able to control my own money on my own terms with my own code. Uh, and there's something that's not easily doable currently. Uh, I'm sure you all know what UPI is. You've all used it. Uh, Specifically, what I want to highlight about UPI is that it's a mobile-first way to interact with your bank account, right? It lets you do a lot of things with your bank account just from a mobile phone. There's two specific aspects I'd like to highlight, is that it's interoperable with almost all bank accounts in India. It currently supports 150 plus banks in India, and via a lot more partnerships, it's actually turns up to hundreds and probably a few thousand banks. This actually gives India the unique opportunity to build a FOSS banking application that will just work for the majority of India, right? And that's a big thing to have if you're able to achieve it. The second important thing is it runs on end user devices. It's not something, that's, for example, payment terminals have been there for a long time, but they run on proprietary hardware on proprietary devices. But in this case, it runs on my device. Part of UPI is running on my iPhone or my Android. And it gives me some partial control in terms of what I can do, right? For example, if I really, really work crazy, I could, put up a robot to actually touch the screen and then hack into UPI by saying, hey, please type my MPIN to do all my transactions for me. But that's not good enough. We want to assert more control over what code runs on my device. I want to have more freedom with my money. So a common theme that you'll hear about UPI is that it's open. It's an open architecture. It's an open protocol. You'll hear the word open protocol, sometimes even the word public good being thrown around. For me, as a hacker and developer, the definition of open is not, something is just out in the open. It's whether I can tinker with it. It's not whether something is uploaded online. It's whether I can run it on my own. As a simple example, I would like to be able to upload all my grocery receipts automatically on Splitwise. That's a simple enough ask, right? I should be able to go through my transactions on UPI, be able to mark them, hey, these are my grocery transactions, upload them automatically on my Splitwise group. I'd like to be able to pay for my rent via a cron job. None of those things are possible today. You can't set up a cron job to run your own bank account today. And I like to do those things, and UPI cuts us close because it's giving me the power over my own device in terms of what I can do. But it comes close, but it doesn't get us there. So is it open? I don't think so. Ultimately, if I can't modify it, if I can't tinker with it, I can't run it wherever I want, it's not open enough for me. So specifically, the early versions of UPI, the specifications for those are open, but those specifications covered the interoperability between various banks. So if you look up the UPI specs, they have an XML API specification that talks about how banks and trusted parties will interact with each other over a private network. So even if you had access to those specifications, you could never write code that actually talk to those APIs unless you're a trusted party. I was lucky enough to work at Razorpay, so I had access to those APIs. I worked with those APIs in the past. But for the end users, there's no way to actually interact with those APIs, even if the specifications are public. So if I can't interact with UPI APIs as a customer, the openness of UPI is a big no for me. So why would you want to do it, right? Why should we have a FOSS banking application that works for India? There are three things. First is accessibility. Right now, UPI as an application only supports iOS and Android. I'd like to be able to do much more. I have a Kindle device with a 3G SIM. Why can't I run my bank account from there? People do run PinePhone and other operating systems on their mobile devices. If I have a SIM card and I have an internet connection, I should be able to use UPI wherever I want. Right now, you can't. If you have an old BlackBerry phone, you can't use UPI. If you have an old Symbian phone, you can't use UPI. So there are restrictions in terms of where all it's accessible, and I'd like to improve upon that. The second reason is obviously freedom. I want the ability to tinker with not just the code that's running on my device, but I want the ability to tinker with my bank account. I want to be able to set cron jobs. I want to be able to hook up my bank account to IFTTT or voice assistants and be able to say, hey, please pay my bill, and I should do it. So this is a FOSS conference. I'm sure all of you already know this stuff. The third reason I would like to do is hackability. I want to build cool hacks on top of UPI. I should be able to build a Raspberry Pi terminal that talks to my bank account. I'd like to teach voice assistants to pay my bills and so on. And I'm sure you're identifying with a lot of these things, right? You should be able to do what you want with your bank account much more easily, programmably. So what's stopping us, right? What is this chasm that we need to break to actually get to a FOSS UPI application? What is stopping in our way? My MacBook's not asleep. there's three problems I want to highlight. The first is UPI is a permissioned highway. It is, think of UPI as a post box to your bank account. You drop in instructions to that post box, and it delivers that to your bank. So, for example, you can you drop a note that says, "Please pay Nemo at the rate UPI $500," and then that that letter goes by a post somehow. It reaches your bank, and then the bank delivers on that guarantee and pays me $500. But in order to get to that post box, there's a highway that you need to. That's a gated highway. It unfortunately has a lot of checks. For example, it only permits certain vehicles or apps. You can't write your own app to actually, for example, I'm sure you've heard the famous analogy of Linux is a tank, right? It's a free tank. It's great. It lets you build upon it as much as you want. And I'd like to have that freedom while running on the UPI highway. I want to be able to drive up a tank to my post box and deliver instructions to my bank account, telling it, hey, you know what, I want to do crazy things on my bank account, please let me do it. As a simple example, UPI mandated collection of GPS data for every financial transaction until very recently. A recent circular from NPCI changed these to actually make it optional, but the change happens, I believe, on December 2022. So as of now, GPA doesn't work, for example, if you don't grant it GPS permissions, right? And that, I believe, is a privacy concern for me. I would like to be able to control what my apps and what my bank account is snitching about me. But I didn't have a choice. You can't write your own code to control your bank account, so I would like to do it. The second concern is obviously around law. If you're looking to re-implement UPI, it's a big ask. There are concerns around re-implementing things that other applications are already doing. You might be in violation of copyright law. There are concerns around breaking DRM in these apps. There are some RBI regulations that you might need to abide by, including mobile banking regulations. However, the Indian Copyright Act does allow exceptions for interoperability. In this specific case, we are interoperating with an existing protocol. There is past jurisprudence around reverse engineering apps and re-implementing them in a clean room fashion, where these things have been done and built lots of businesses without violating copyright. So a third concern is security. As a security professional, I do care about security, not just of myself, but of end users as well. Will publishing such things create security concerns? I've grappled with this question a lot, but looking at the pace at which UPI is growing and the additional different ways of interacting with UPI that have shown up over time, I believe the answer is no. The security of UPI is not dependent, should not be dependent upon obscurity. Shouldn't be, how my device is talking to my bank account shouldn't affect the security of how it is doing it. Ultimately, the security of UPI hinges upon the cryptography and the security decisions and the architecture that the designers of UPI have thought upon and the choices that they've made. And it doesn't rely upon making sure that the code is as written as possible and it can't be re-implemented ever. So I'll go through a little bit on how UPI works to understand how we can get to a roadmap. Any questions so far? No? All right. So this is how the different parties that you can talk to as an end user while you're interacting with UPI, right? The first is NPCI. You can directly talk to NPCI, for example, over Beam app. In that case, your mobile app, which is Beam, is directly interacting with NPCI servers. The second way you can talk is via bank. This can be either your own bank or a third-party bank. So, for example, me, despite having, let's say, an HDFC account, I can use either the HDFC UPI app or the ICICI UPI app, and both should still work for me. The third way is to talk via TSP, which is a technical service provider, such as PhonePe or GPay or WhatsApp, where they would have a sponsor bank on the backend to actually talk to the UPI network. So these three major ways we can interact with UPI as an end customer. Whatever we end up doing has to talk to end up talking to these three trusted parties. So I lied a little. One of those trusted parties gives us two different ways. One is obviously Beam, which I mentioned. The other is this neat service called *99#. It was a very old service launched to actually make IMPS accessible over feature phones back in 2012. It was revamped and upgraded as, I believe, USSD *99# from NUUP in 2016 to actually account for UPI. Right now, if you type *99# on your phone, like I used to do *123# for balance checks long ago, you actually can access UPI over a feature phone or a dumb phone. But it does have some restrictions I'll get into in a minute. But that's another way you can actually interact with UPI. What happens when you do interact? So on the front side, we do have the same parties. But on the back side, ultimately, like I mentioned, the post box analogy, right? The letter must reach your bank. whatever letter you are signing in terms of, I need this much money, or please somebody else may pay me this much money, or what are the recent transactions on my account, so on. These instructions must ultimately reach your bank. And for that to happen, all the trusted parties, NPCI, must interact with the bank on a backend. The bank's apps, for example, I can use the ICICI app, and that will, on the backend, interact with my HDFC account. If I have a trusted service provider, like let's say PhonePe, it might talk to my HDFC bank account via Yes Bank and so on. So no matter which party I use, the instructions must reach my bank account somehow, but that is oblivious to me as the end user, right? And all I care about is interacting with the parties on the left. So let's split this up. We have two different cases, where one is where you actually talk to your own bank account, and there are cases where you don't talk to your own bank account. So I want to split out the specific case where you're talking to your own bank account. And this is a very niche case where, for example, if I install the HDFC mobile net banking app, log into it, and then it lets me use UPI, but other customers, for example, if I'm an ICICI customer, I can't use that app, because it asks me for my customer ID and my user ID. I need to have an HDFC relationship to actually make use of that, and that drops away our interoperability requirement. If I build upon such a thing, it doesn't get us to access to a lot of customers. So let's drop that. That leaves us with 4 still choices. Let's highlight the *9 and hash thing. If you have never used it, it's fairly easy to use. You can just type *9 and hash to interact with your bank account. It works on feature phones, which is nice. It does help with the accessibility requirements. It's already usable. For example, if you have a Pine phone or BlackBerry, you can still use it. It's not great in terms of the features that it offers, or navigating through a large list of beneficiaries and so on, but it works. So what's the issue? Turns out there are some serious limitations with not just *9 and hash, but especially if you want to build on top of *9 and hash. The first is that if you want to programmatically call USSD codes is the service codes that define *9 and hash or *123 hash and these kind of interactions. If you want to programmatically call these, iOS does not permit it for security reasons, which for example, if you dial a specific code, you can do call forwarding, and that's considered a security risk by Apple, so it doesn't permit it. Android does permit it, but it has some limitations in terms of what all you can do. For example, the UPI pin can never be entered programmatically easily on your device. In order to get around those limitations, you need to grant more permissions to your app. And the way, this is a common problem. It's not just a problem that we're seeing in India. It's a problem that a lot of fintech companies and banks have faced in Africa, where USSD-based payments are huge. So there's a lot of wrapper SDKs and libraries and companies that have built up to build wrapper apps on top of USSD protocols. And the way they work is they ask for accessibility permissions that basically scrapes through all the USSD prompts that will show up. So you type *99 *1 hash, and then a prompt shows up saying, hey, who do you want to pay? Instead of letting that prompt show, it'll just programmatically give you a hook and say, hey, what do you want to answer this prompt with? But that's something I consider like a trade-off. Do you want to give accessibility permissions to a new application? It's considered a security risk by Android. It doesn't give it very easily. You have to go into settings, enable it, and so on. The third thing is USSD is insecure. It's an ancient protocol. It runs on plain text. There's very little encryption for USSD between you and the cell tower, basically. So if someone were to sniff the air, they can get that data fairly easily. It's unreliable. NPCI claims a 24/7 uptime. I haven't seen that. It doesn't work across all telcos. It currently works, I believe, across 4 major telcos. Jio is one major dropout that doesn't support *9 and hash at all. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. I think it's something to do with their 4G network, but I'm not sure. It's also a very ancient protocol. If we have modern TLS-based apps, why can't we use that? So yeah, there are some limitations, but this is a doable thing. You can take *9 and hash, write up a wrapper on top of it, and get an actual functioning UPI app on any device you want. So what next? We have 3 more choices still left, which is TSPs such as PhonePe and GPay. We have third-party banks. Let's call it AU Bank, for example. And so finally, you can also directly talk to NPCI Beam. Let's take all these 3 and club them together. At the end of the day, what they are doing is fairly similar. You communicate to the app, and the app on the backend talks to a trusted party. If you go back to our early diagram, it's going to be talking and forwarding your whatever instructions you give to your bank account. How it is doing it is going to be fairly similar in terms of structure. It's going to be using similar calls to actually register your device. It's going to be using similar calls to actually transfer your instructions. For example, every UPI app must take the PIN. The PIN must be submitted to your bank account. It must go in such and such fashion. So there's a lot of strictness enforced by just these interoperability requirements. So all of these things can actually be clubbed together. So what happens if we club them together is we end up with a generic UPI app which has two primary components. The first is the NPCI common library. This is what, for example, powers your PIN entry, and it does some device registration bits. The second is the bank foo code. It's basically the generic piece of code that talks to your bank. It can, for example, talk to the banking APIs to get you access to your transaction history. It might be able to talk to your bank account to get your saved beneficiaries. So yeah, this is like a fairly strict separation of responsibilities across all UPI apps. The NPCI app is responsible for some parts of the device registration, accepting the PIN, and the bank foo code will actually just talk to the bank. The NPCI library never actually communicates to the internet. All that communication is proxied through by the bank side. So all of this is now again like bringing me back into, hey, there are some objections. Is this all big violation of copyright? You can't just take this code, and I agree. You can't just republish all these apps and call them open source. That's not how it should be done. I'm not handling these arguments, but I believe there is a way for us to do it in a clean room fashion to actually get us to a FOSS UPI app. So here's a little roadmap. This is what I've been mentioning for the star 9 and hash. Let's say we take up the star 9 and hash service, right? It's not documented currently in terms of how it behaves, even publicly as an end customer. There's no, you're expected to just type star 9 and hash and go through the menus and figure out. If you don't see the menu you want, you just keep it trial and error and clicking through the menus till you find what you need. What if there was a public specification that said, hey, this is how the star 9 and hash service behaves. Maybe it's machine readable. Other apps can integrate with it. You can build like a nice UI on top of it. There might be some limitations from all platforms that might support it. For example, you can't really do it much on iOS, but on other platforms, if you have a Linux phone, maybe you can hack upon it much more. So yeah, if we had a star 9 hash specification, if you were able to wrap it up in an app, we would be able to actually launch a fully functional UPI app on FDroid. That sounds cool, right? So the alternative is much more harder. If we have a common library specification, and the reason I'm mentioning the word specification is because this gives us a way to clean room reverse engineer these applications. If there is a clear separation between the person who has seen a disassembly of a code and the person who's actually rewriting that code in a different language, without having seen the original piece, it gives a clear separation in terms of copyright laws to make sure that whatever you're rewriting is only for the interoperability requirements. So we want a clean specification for how the common library behaves, which is to say, if I'm typing a PIN or for the device registration bit, there are some specific challenge strings that you need to generate. How are those things generated? If, let's say, we had such a specification, you could take that specification, implement it up, and still get stuck. You want to talk to the bank. Then you need to do the same thing for one bank. The cool thing here, because UPI is interoperable, is you only need to do this once. If you have a single common library implementation, it's called shared across all apps, right? And you have a single implementation plus a specification for how at least one banking app behaves. It could be a TSP, it could be your bank app, it could be somebody else's bank app. If you have at least one of just those two things from any one combination, you have a UPI implementation that actually works across all banks. So the interoperability thing helps us leverage a lot more than what we are doing. We can additionally repeat the last two steps to build it more, for example, pluggable. If somebody does not want to talk to HDFC, they prefer talking to ICICI, we can plug it up and they can just talk to that specific backend. So yeah, this is how both the roadmaps look together. We have two different pathways. First is fairly clean and straightforward in terms of implementing. It has some serious limitations in terms of what we'll be able to do. We won't be able to launch an iOS app, for example. The second way gets us much more closer, but there are some concerns around the hard work that is involved and actually reversing and figuring this out, as well as making sure you're doing it in a clean room manner. So yeah, I do have some good news to close off this talk. I have a public implementation for the common library specifications. You can look it up on librefin.in. I also have a working common library implementation, which I'm not currently publishing. I would like somebody else to take up the right side of things to convert the specification into actual working code. I do have a working implementation of multiple banks as well, but I'm publishing only the specification side of things to make sure that somebody else implements these bank bits. And once again, we only need one banking implementation to work. We don't need to have actually talk to all the banks. If you have one working, it works across all banks, across all customers. Similarly, I have a public specification for the star9 hash specifications. I wrote up a terrible looking mobile app which worked on Android as a wrapper on top of it. But I'm not a mobile dev. I don't think I like it enough to open source it. I'd like somebody else to take that up. But yeah, these are the bits there that are there. You can look it up on github.com/librefin-in. Additionally, there's a list of like tasks and requirements uploaded there, which you can look up on the README in terms of what are the next steps in order for us to get there. But I believe we can have a public FOSS app for UPI. Thank you. Oh yeah, I forgot to. I have two people to thank. Thank you, Garima, on whose borrowed Android phone I did a lot of this research for the last 2 years, and to Karan Saini for some very important insights around UPI. Thank you.
Anybody has questions? Nemo's still got 5 minutes. I do have a question actually.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about the security implications of this? Not just in the context of, the programming side of things, right? I'm talking about security as a regulator would look at it, because this would have to be regulated at the end of the day. Because it's a financial payments app, it has to be regulated. And the regulators' purview would always look at the most vulnerable and would want to protect that person, right? Your most vulnerable target is who you have to protect, and that is where you have to look at. So an open source app, there is also the responsibility of ensuring that even the most vulnerable and the least informed user does not get defrauded because of the app or through some other version of the app.
The RBI has clear mobile banking security guidelines in India. I've gone through those guidelines, and I believe that it's still feasible for a FOSS app to actually be published under those. For example, a lot of requirements that banking apps actually enforce are mentioned as recommendations by RBI, such as they must check whether the device is jailbroken or not, or whether it passes Google safety checks. They're not all mandatory requirements. You can look up the doc, but that is one, like from the regulator's perspective, it might be a new question, open question, but I believe these questions need to be raised if we want to have FOSS banking. From security perspective, if let's say I'm an attacker, right? I think from the hacker mindset, if I'm a hacker, I have far easier ways to hack bank accounts, which is, for example, the star9 and hash service. It lets me reset the entirety of whatever we are doing with, let's say, open source implementation of all of this is already doable via just typing out USSD codes on a device, right? So it's not something that is hard to do for a new attacker. These are all much more easier ways for an attacker to use through, provided they already have access to your device. I'll repeat your question.
Very interesting talk. I like the whole concept of it. So, but my question is that, so I have one little apprehension. Being a patent law researcher, I have recently come to know that NPCI is actually trying to get it patented, the UPI system. So, I think that would be a major hurdle to your whole project, because if it actually happens, they've already filed a patent application. So if they go through with it, that would be a major problem to your project. So what are your thoughts on that?
I would argue that it depends on the scope of the patent. If it covers the entirety of the UPI ecosystem, I believe that is not something we are infringing upon. The majority of innovation in UPI lies around how the banks talk to each other. The little piece of code that we actually are re-implementing in the common library from NPCI, that I believe cannot be patented. It's just an algorithm that we are publishing in plain text as a specification. And I don't think, like, I listened to your talk yesterday very intently. You mentioned the hardware requirements to actually get patents. There are no hardware requirements as such on the whole common library.
Yeah, sorry, I had a follow-up, but I lost the mic. So also, like, this is in general, okay, this does not apply just to the UPI FOSS app. It applies to all FOSS projects or all software projects for that matter. From a developer standpoint, what responsibility would you assume for a project that you publish that could later lead to a problem, right? Like, for example, you in your talk said star9 and hash is not a secure protocol, and someone sniffing there could possibly intercept traffic very easily. And you already have specifications for wrapping that protocol into an app. So how does that?
I think the responsibility for star and hash should lie with the maker, right? This has been decided and this has been regulated by RBI in terms of allowing star and hash to go through as a service, knowing that there are some concerns around security of how the communication happens. I believe they have considered these risks, and the way the risks, I don't think the risk, specifically for star and hash, the risks change in any manner, whether you're using it programmatically or not.
It would change if adoption increases. Again, so this is
Yeah.
not particularly for this, right? Like I'm in general asking how does a developer look? So I'm not a developer. How does a developer look at personal responsibility when building a project for further implications of that project that may be second, third, fourth, fifth order effects of what you do?
I, I, I think my primary aim as a hacker, as a tinkerer, is to actually work with my bank account programmatically, right? I believe there are enough people who also care about the same thing. The security implications are obviously there, but specifically when you're re-implementing things, the implications are primarily on the original projects. On the downstream side, we do have implications in terms of making sure that the application itself is secure and safe. If you were to launch it, for example, on FDroid, make sure that it's signed properly, it's not vulnerable to common attacks and so on. Especially, for example, RBI has regulations around not having open SQL queries within your Android apps. And those are fairly common, straightforward things that you might have to go through. You might even want to do a pen test run before actually publishing the final application pieces. But those are things that are much more easier in hurdles to pass through compared to the hurdles that UPI has already had to pass through as a large-scale project in India. It has already seen huge adoption, right? Those hurdles have already been cleared by UPI in terms of security, most of them at the very least, yeah.
Nemo?
Yeah. So, I mean, you're not a lawyer, but still the question is that if I create the wrapper for the star 99 hash specification for myself, and I just use it on my phone, like from a legal perspective, where do I lie if I do this?
I think fairly you are in a clear, like, you are ultimately just using the star and hash service. It's up to you. There's no regulations around how you interact with that service at all, from what I know.
Okay. And then let's say publishing the code of that on GitHub, how about at that point?
Like, this is clearly code that you have written on your own to interact with a third-party service. For example, if you were to write your own code to interact with the RazoRPay service, right?
Right.
You're clearly in the open. There's something that you've innovated upon yourself. It just interacts with a third party that has published its own specifications. Star and hash is a public service. It is accessible by all of India. It is not something that is proprietary. That is not something that only certain people have access to. It's not something that's even authenticated beyond using your own SIM, right? If you publish code that talks to your public service, I believe you're clear.
But I mean, current like the IT Act has this very blanket rule which is unauthorized access. So like if say somebody has like say CBSE marks, if you just change the roll number and you get somebody else's result, there have been cases where that has been considered by the police as hacking technically. So in that sense, like because unless there is some legal document which says that using this API is legal, is it legal? I mean,
Oh, I don't think like this is splitting hairs. I would rather prefer moving on to the second question. Like, if I'm talking to a public service using code that I write, irrespective of whichever service it is, and I publish that code, I believe that is fair and clear.
got it.
Like,
Hey, Nemo, thank you so much for giving that talk. I relate so much to this talk because I remember reading that same UPI spec and being frustrated by how not open that is. Like, and then, like, I wanted to do something, not write a cron job, but do something else with like my.
Like there are real requirements for why these things are closed. We do have banking regulations in India, and not all of these, like especially when you have a trusted intermediary setup, like how banking works in India, you do want those checks and balances in place. But at the end of the day, as an end customer, I should have control on bank account. That's all.
And then I remember like reverse engineering Paytm's API. So like by doing a reverse proxy, and I think I have a fairly large chunk of the common library implementation for Paytm Bank. And then, so yeah, I'm just thank you so much for bringing this up. But I think not just with like even with this, it's like the bank is still like we're still at the end of the day interacting with the bank API, and I feel like in India, we need just like a newer bank, right? So for example, in the EU, there's a bank called Bunk, which got like a license, like a banking license after 35 years. Like the last banking license was 35 years ago. And then it was a bank that was completely built on AWS and had like all of its APIs open. And I feel like we need a bank like that in
I
India.
did have a third roadmap on my list that I didn't get to talk about. I skipped that slide. But the other alternative, other than those two specific roadmaps, is to actually have a bank that publishes their code, right? It's very unlikely they will be able to publish the common library code. But if we were able to implement it in a clean room manner, maybe they can use our code instead. Or even if it's not possible, we'll still have an open core sort of bank app. Those are things still feasible. For example, the Kerala Bank in India does have an open source mandate across the board, but we haven't seen them adopt UPI yet, I think.
Thanks, Nemo. I think you voiced a lot of frustrations for a lot of people in this audience with respect to banking apps. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for taking your time for this.
Thanks a lot, everyone. You've been a great audience. The project is at librefin.in. Feel free to check it out. Thank you.